Welcome to the True Guy Globe Brief Updates. Subscribe and press the bell icon for updates. The world was stunned. Assad flees Damascus. The news broke like a thunderclap, reverberating across continents. For years, the Syrian president had seemed immovable, his grip on power unshakable despite the horrors of war. But now, in a single night, everything had changed. For years, Syria's civil war raged, millions displaced, hundreds of thousands dead, yet Assad endured, propped up by powerful allies. Cities were reduced to rubble, families torn apart, and a generation grew up knowing only conflict. The world watched in horror as the humanitarian crisis deepened, but the regime, with support from Russia and Iran, clung to power. But now, the regime was collapsing, the dictator on the run. Government buildings once bustling with officials were left deserted, files scattered, and the air thick with panic. The sense of order that had defined Assad's rule was replaced by chaos and fear. In Damascus, celebration and gunfire filled the air as state TV went dark, the presidential palace abandoned. For the first time in years, the city's skyline was lit not by artillery fire but by fireworks and tracer rounds fired in jubilation. The symbols of Assad's authority, his palace, his media, were now empty shells. Rumors swirled. Was Assad captured, killed, or had he escaped? In every cafe and street corner, people whispered theories, their faces a mix of hope and disbelief. The uncertainty was palpable as Syrians dared to imagine a future without the man who had dominated their lives for so long. World leaders scrambled for answers, emergency meetings convened. The sudden collapse of the regime sent shockwaves through diplomatic circles. Allies and adversaries alike wondered what would come next, as the balance of power in the region shifted overnight. Assad's fall shattered a decade-long geopolitical constant, sending shockwaves across the Middle East. Analysts debated the consequences on live television, while headlines screamed of revolution and uncertainty. The region, already volatile, now faced a new and unpredictable chapter. Power vacuums emerged, alliances strained, and Syria's future grew even more uncertain. Rebel groups jockeyed for control, old enemies became uneasy partners, and the threat of further violence loomed large. The end of Assad did not mean the end of conflict, it was only the beginning of a new struggle for Syria's soul. The final chapter of the Assad dynasty was being written in chaos and blood. Streets once filled with parades now ran with fear and confusion. Civilians, caught between hope and terror, fled the violence, unsure if safety or more suffering awaited them. It all began with peaceful protests, inspired by the Arab Spring. Ordinary Syrians, emboldened by uprisings in neighboring countries, took to the streets demanding dignity, freedom, and reform. Their voices, at first hopeful and united, echoed through Damascus and beyond. The regime's violent crackdown turned hope into civil war. What started as calls for change quickly descended into brutality, tear gas, bullets, and mass arrests. The government's iron fist crushed dissent, but also ignited a fire that would rage for years. Assad miscalculated, believing force would crush dissent, as his father had done. He relied on the old playbook of fear and repression, convinced that the people would eventually submit. But the world had changed, and so had Syria. He underestimated his people and the complexities of a new era. Syrians from all walks of life, young and old, men and women from every background stood together, refusing to be silenced. Their resilience became the regime's undoing. The fire he lit ultimately consumed his own regime. The violence he unleashed spiraled beyond his control, engulfing not just his enemies, but his own power base. The symbols of his rule, statues, flags, government offices, were reduced to ashes. Now, the world watched as the dictator who once seemed untouchable fled the inferno he created. Cameras captured the empty convoys racing through the night, the final act of a leader who had lost everything. The streets of Damascus, once symbols of power, now echoed with uncertainty. Checkpoints stood deserted, military vehicles left behind, and the city's heart beat with anxiety and anticipation. The silence from the regime spoke louder than any speech. The once relentless propaganda machine had gone quiet, leaving only static and empty podiums as reminders of a vanished authority. The era of Assad was ending, not with a declaration, but with a desperate escape. The gates of power swung open, not for a triumphant leader, but for a hasty retreat into the darkness. Syria's fate hung in the balance, the world holding its breath. In capitals around the globe, leaders and citizens alike watched events unfold, knowing that what happened next would shape the region for generations. The impossible had happened. The regime was no more. In the streets, people tore down portraits, waved flags, and dared to hope that, after years of darkness, a new dawn might finally break over Syria. It all began quietly in the southern city of Daraa, where a group of teenagers, inspired by the winds of change sweeping across the Arab world, dared to scrawl anti-regime graffiti on their school wall. Their message was simple but powerful. "It's your turn, doctor," a direct challenge to President Bashar al-Assad, who was once a practicing ophthalmologist. The regime's response was swift and merciless. Security forces rounded up the teenagers, subjecting them to brutal torture. When the people of Daraa protested demanding their release, the government answered with gunfire, arrests and a campaign of intimidation that shocked the nation. But instead of silencing dissent, the crackdown ignited a firestorm. Syrians from every walk of life, students, workers, mothers and elders, poured into the streets, united by a longing for freedom and dignity. They marched peacefully, armed only with hope and homemade banners. Assad's government, desperate to maintain control, labeled these ordinary citizens as terrorists and unleashed overwhelming force to crush the uprising. Tanks rolled into city streets, snipers took positions on rooftops, and mass arrests swept through neighborhoods. Torture and fear became the regime's answer to calls for change. The opposition, which had begun as a peaceful movement, soon faced an impossible choice: surrender to oppression or take up arms in self-defense. As the violence escalated, soldiers began to defect, refusing to fire on their own people. These defectors formed the Free Syrian Army, shifting the movement's goal from reform to outright regime change. Armed resistance spread rapidly, and the dream of a peaceful revolution was lost amid the chaos of urban warfare. The conflict soon drew in regional and global powers, each backing different sides with weapons, money, and political support. Syria became the epicenter of a devastating proxy war. What started as a protest over a few words of graffiti spiraled into a catastrophe, leaving entire neighborhoods in ruins and millions displaced. The hope for democracy and a better future was buried beneath the rubble, as Syria descended into chaos and despair. The unity of the uprising fractured, with opposition groups turning on each other, and the suffering of ordinary Syrians deepened as the war dragged on. The world watched in horror and helplessness as Syria's fate was rewritten in blood, its tragedy broadcast across the globe. Yet, in the empty streets of Daraa, where it all began, the seeds of resistance and hope for Assad's downfall were sown, echoing the courage of those first teenagers who dared to dream of change. As the rebels struggled, Turkey became their lifeline. Once Assad's ally, Turkey opened its borders, sending weapons, supplies and fighters into northern Syria. Advanced arms like American tow missiles gave rebels new power, allowing them to challenge regime tanks and seize territory. Major offensives in Aleppo and Damascus brought the war to Assad's doorstep. But the influx of weapons also fueled extremist groups and infighting among rebels. The lack of unity within the opposition became a fatal weakness. Turkey's support changed the war, but also set the stage for chaos. The rebel front fractured, splintering into hundreds of groups with clashing agendas. This chaos allowed ISIS to rise, seizing territory and declaring a caliphate in 2014. Assad exploited ISIS's brutality, recasting himself as a bulwark against terrorism. The mainstream rebels were trapped, fighting both Assad and ISIS, draining their strength. The war's complexity made victory elusive for all sides. Amid the chaos, Syria's Kurds carved out autonomy in the north, led by the YPG. The US, seeking to defeat ISIS, partnered with the Kurds, forming the Syrian Democratic Forces. With US air power and Kurdish ground troops, ISIS's caliphate was dismantled. The SDF now controls a quarter of Syria, but faces threats from Turkey, Assad and shifting US priorities. This alliance angered Turkey, complicating regional dynamics. The Kurds' future remains uncertain, caught between powerful rivals. Assad's survival depended on Russia, Iran and Hezbollah, but by the mid-2020s, cracks appeared. Russia was bogged down in Ukraine, Iran faced internal turmoil, and Hezbollah was stretched thin. Russian airstrikes dwindled, Iranian support faltered, and Hezbollah pulled back to defend Lebanon. Assad's regime, once propped up by this alliance, found itself increasingly isolated. The flow of money, fighters and weapons slowed to a trickle. The axis of resistance was fraying, leaving Assad dangerously exposed. The regime's foundation was crumbling from within and without. As Assad's allies faltered, rebels seized their chance. Russian air support was delayed, Iranian reinforcements scarce, and Hezbollah reluctant to commit. The Syrian army, hollowed out by years of war, couldn't hold the line. Rebel groups, especially Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, launched bold offensives. The regime's defenses collapsed on multiple fronts. The pillars that once held Assad up were shaking all at once. The power vacuum emboldened the opposition. The final offensive was underway, targeting the heart of Assad's power. The endgame had begun. The final rebel assault began with a surprise attack on Hama, a city that had long stood as a symbol of Assad's iron-fisted rule and the site of past massacres. The world watched as the city once again became the epicenter of conflict, its streets echoing with gunfire and explosions. Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, the most formidable rebel faction, led the charge. Their fighters moved swiftly and with precision, catching regime forces completely off guard. The element of surprise was total, and panic spread among government troops as their lines collapsed. Demoralized and outgunned, the Syrian army crumbled under the relentless assault. Soldiers deserted their posts, some surrendering without a fight, others fleeing in disarray, leaving behind weapons and uniforms. Within days, rebels controlled Hama. The city's fall sent shockwaves through the regime and inspired hope among opposition supporters across the country. Crowds poured into the streets, celebrating what seemed like the impossible. The dominoes fell quickly. Homs, another key city, surrendered soon after. With two major strongholds lost, the road to Damascus now lay wide open, and the regime's grip on power weakened by the hour. Panic gripped the capital. As news of the rebel advance spread, government officials scrambled to evacuate, and civilians rushed to find safety. The regime's command structure began to break down, with confusion and fear taking hold. Rebel advances accelerated. Government-held areas, once heavily fortified, now offered little resistance. Checkpoints were deserted, and regime buildings stood empty, their occupants having fled. The psychological barrier that had protected Assad for years shattered in an instant. Crowds tore down his portraits, and the fear that once kept people silent was replaced by a sense of liberation and defiance. The population, exhausted by years of war and hardship, did not resist the rebels. Many simply watched in silence, too weary to cheer, but relieved that the fighting might finally end. Assad, isolated in his heavily guarded palace, saw the writing on the wall. Surrounded by only his most loyal guards, he realized that his time in power was coming to an end. His military had disintegrated, and his foreign allies, once the pillars of his regime, were now powerless to save him. Advisors from Iran and Russia quietly withdrew, their promises of support now meaningless. The time for escape had come. Under the cover of darkness, convoys slipped away from the palace and helicopters lifted off, carrying the last remnants of Assad's inner circle to uncertain futures. The regime's collapse was now inevitable. Across Syria and the world, people watched as decades of authoritarian rule unraveled in a matter of days, marking the true beginning of the end. In the regime's final hours, Assad's escape plan was set in motion. An old Soviet-era jet was readied at a Damascus airbase chosen for its stealth. As fighting closed in, Assad and his family boarded the plane under cover of night. The flight path winding over Iraq and Iran avoided hostile airspace. Mid-flight GPS jamming nearly doomed the escape, but experienced pilots regained control. After a tense journey, Russian fighter jets escorted the plane to a secure base near Moscow. Assad, once Syria's unyielding ruler, stepped onto Russian soil, deposed and exiled. His reign ended not with a speech but a desperate flight. The dictator's era was over. Syria's future was now uncertain. Assad's fall left Syria fractured, a patchwork of rival territories. In the west, remnants of the regime cling to a coastal enclave under Russian protection. The SDF controls the north and east, balancing U.S. support against Turkish threats and ISIS remnants. Turkey dominates the northern border, establishing a protectorate. Idlib is ruled by Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, governing millions despite its extremist label. Iran and its proxies linger near Damascus and the Iraqi border. ISIS, though defeated as a state, wages insurgency in the desert. Syria's map is a mosaic of conflict, with peace still out of reach. Assad's fall ended an era, but not Syria's suffering. His brutal tactics and reliance on foreign powers sowed the seeds of his own demise. The simultaneous collapse of his allies opened the door for the rebels. The fall of Hama was the tipping point, Assad's escape, an admission of defeat. Syria remains divided, awash in weapons and militias. Millions of refugees dream of return, but home is now a memory or a battleground. Rebuilding will take generations. Sectarian wounds run deep. Assad's fall reshapes the Middle East, but peace is elusive. For Syrians, the end of dictatorship brings uncertainty, not relief. The war's darkness lingers, and a stable Syria remains a distant hope.